How you doing? I'm in Jackson, Mississippi. Had an epiphany when I came here, and this is my first time in the city. Behind me it looks like a theater, and you can see it's a beautiful building. Before I came here, I went down to the new state capitol, and I guess I had a couple of epiphanies. I saw a monument to the Confederacy, essentially, praising the daughters and the wives of the Confederate soldiers who assisted the wounded and so on and so forth. And essentially the motto was, lest we forget. In other words, lest we forget the sacrifices of essentially the Confederate military. And there's a beautiful sunset over there. I'm just going to show you this here as well. A lot of French themed architecture here. A lot of this seems actually that makes sense, right? New Orleans is a French port. This has to be close to New Orleans, and so you have a lot of French influence here as well. In the architecture, you'll see the fleur de lis in several places, and ultimately, when I was at the new state capitol, it dawned on me that, remember, from one perspective, it seems a bit odd to build a monument to an institution that lost a war. But on the other hand, remember that there's a value in letting the defeated, sunset's right behind me, you can't really see it from this view. There's value in letting the defeated party tell its story. Because what you don't want is for the defeated party in a war to be exploited. And part of that exploitation happens through removing monuments, removing whatever represented the old ways. And so, on the one hand, it's really odd to have a monument that again, it's obviously not celebrating war, it's celebrating sacrifices. And so, if you look at it from the perspective that the South and the Confederacy have a right to remember the sacrifices of their soldiers, despite the fact that they lost the war, I guess it makes a little bit more sense. And if you go against that, then what you're really saying is the defeated do not get to tell their story. Their monuments do not get to stand. And if you're going to make that argument, then on principle, you're also saying that the slaves here may not be able to get to tell their story, and that the monuments to their suffering and their defeat should be wiped out as well. So history is a funny thing, and you want all the perspectives you possibly can get. In part because you don't want to show up one day to downtown and see nothing but shopping malls and the same chain stores. And then part of that means that you have to preserve your history. When I was in Atlanta, the National Park Service took over a lot of the Martin Luther King related monuments and historical sites. Just drove down from Montgomery, Alabama. The National Park Service, for whatever reason, has not been involved as much in the preservation of the architecture, of the civil rights related architecture within Alabama. And so as a result, a few important sites, well, one of them is a hotel now. And I went into the hotel and I asked, it's a very important site. I don't want to get into the details here, but there's no evidence that it's a historical site, none whatsoever. It's a very important site. It used to be a drugstore that allowed essentially the bus boycott to happen because it was on private property that could not be accessed by the police. It was a property that was owned by a white store owner, and there's no evidence of that at all today. So when you talk about preservation of things, you're talking about preservation of history, and so that kind of dawned on me when I saw it, because I was really sort of put off by when I started reading the inscription, realizing that the front of the Capitol building is essentially a monument to the old ways. But if you look at it in a different way, if you look at it in the sense that it's the preservation of history, you're allowing the defeated to tell their side, it takes on a different sort of connotation. The second thing that dawned on me is that a lot of the development here is only in downtown, from what I can tell. Now, you can see that this looks like every other successful downtown layout. Big buildings, a bank building somewhere, Regions Financial is a big one here. Lots of churches. Looks like Gothic architecture. French. And it's German as well, but in Cologne, Germany. But anyway, obviously the Notre Dame is, but so and so. But you can see how. Actually, I'm not sure if this is. It's really hard. I'm not an expert on church architecture, but this may not actually. I have to backtrack. This may not be French themed. It's hard to tell. Very hard to tell. This is an Episcopalians. I don't know anything about that particular sect, so I can't tell you anything about it. But it is a beautiful church. Behind me over here, so you have another beautiful building. When I visit the South, I'm looking for, just a lot of beautiful buildings, because both before the war and after the war, a lot of the land here was concentrated in the hands of a few landowners that were affiliated with the banks. And that's probably true all over the world, but particularly in the South. And so that's why every downtown has a major bank building. I don't know what building that is. And my point here was that if you, about 2 blocks from here, I'm not joking, 4 blocks from here, is essentially a tenement housing structure. It's a what do we used to call them? Not lap houses, but it's just a tenement row. Tenement row, blown out windows, not fit for habitation. This is the governor's mansion. Four blocks from here are houses unfit for living. My point here in saying that is not to denigrate the city of Jackson, Mississippi. It's to point out that development, in order to protect its investment, typically gets concentrated in downtown in every city in America. The difference is that when that money comes in from development, it creates a flywheel effect, or it creates a cascading effect that allows that investment to trickle into other areas, especially when there's a university that's about 1.5 miles from here. That hasn't happened here. And I'm just trying to figure out why, but the starkness of the contrast made me realize that, city development as is has resulted in more segregation, especially when a lot of that investment goes into downtown. The same thing with New Orleans. In order to protect their investment in the downtown area, the French Quarter, the city of New Orleans is lovely as long as you only stay in the French Quarter. Once you leave the French Quarter, there are ghettos all around you. This isn't necessarily surprising because New Orleans was a major slave port. But what is surprising is that when the money came in that built all these magnificent buildings, that restored a post office and courthouse that you see behind you, behind me, that somehow that money wasn't also allocated to surrounding areas. And so the reason it wasn't done so is based only partly on history. It's really based now on the desire for capital to protect itself. And the way you do that is very simple. You essentially cordon off an area of the city that you can control better and police better in order to protect your investment. That involves a grid system sometimes. It involves anything really that allows a secure presence to be assigned immediately. And when you go downtown, when you go outside of the downtown area, it's difficult to drive around. There's potholes everywhere. It's not very easy to secure the premises. Would be very difficult to get an ambulance over there very quickly. And so when you look at, here's the banking building right behind me. And so when you look at economic development, people keep thinking that the new Jim Crow, or they talk about voting laws being the new Jim Crow. They talk about the prisoner lease system being the new Jim Crow. There's an argument there. But another Jim Crow that nobody talks about is economic development. And it's not racially based anymore. It's simply the desire of capital to protect its investments. And the way you do that is standard all across the world. And it's standard because it works. It's just that in some places, that investment creates a cascading effect that makes everywhere around that investment, that real estate investment, a better place. Because typically if you have all these amenities, you've got beautiful buildings, banks, grocery stores, eventually people are going to want to live around here, right? They may want to work here as well. You have a lot of office buildings. The transition from a manufacturing economy to a services-based economy has allowed a lot of these structures to come into a densely packed city because of the shift from manufacturing that allows thousands of jobs to be created in every one of these buildings. There's a healthcare building behind me. There's a planetarium behind me. Remember, 4 blocks from here are tenement housing, a tenement row. In California, we call that Skid Row in California and Los Angeles, where the homeless are. 4 blocks from here. So when you're talking about equality, you have to consider how to create a system that protects capital while at the same time protecting the people and protecting economic opportunity. Because now what's happened is that the capital has been deployed in a way that has cemented segregation, and in doing so made the neighborhoods 4 blocks from here uninvestable. You're not going to be the one, if you have an opportunity to invest, you're going to want to invest here. You might want to take over a building. If you're a real estate developer, you're going to want to invest in this area. It's a guaranteed investment. You're not going to want to move 4 blocks away where there's no economy and nobody wants to live there. It's a risk. Now we have ways of dealing with that in the tax code, obviously. We have tax credits, we have redevelopment zones. But what you see now is that in America, the discussion has been based on race rather than poor deployment of capital and venture capital in particular. And if we're able to shift that discussion to something that's maybe a little bit more neutral and that can be fact-checked and verified through data, maybe we can get somewhere. And I hope that's the case. This is a beautiful city. It's got a university 1.5 miles from here. And there's no reason why this level of inequality should be so apparent next to each other. But that's one of the benefits of allowing the preservation of the history, of allowing the preservation of what came before you. If you don't redevelop that area over there, it probably looks like what it looked like 50 years ago. And then it makes it a little bit easier to understand what I'm trying to say. Without having seen that, if that area had been successfully developed, I wouldn't have had that epiphany. So when you talk about taking down monuments, you're also talking about a similar phenomenon that makes it harder to understand history. And that's another argument that you want to consider along with the economic side of it.